Cincinnati, we need to talk. Because there is a storm brewing on the Bengals' offensive line that almost nobody outside of Ohio is paying attention to, and by the time the rest of the football world catches up, it might already be too late. What's up, everybody? Dre here from Street Hoops, and today we are diving into one of the most quietly explosive storylines heading into the 2026 NFL season. I'm talking about Amarius Mims. Yes, the right tackle. Yes, the guy most casual fans still think of as that big dude the Bengals took in the first round a couple years ago. Well, that big dude is about to become a problem for the entire AFC North, and honestly, for a lot of the AFC period. Buckle up, because this one's got everything. Raw dominance, a redemption arc, some receipts on tape that are going to make you do a double take, and a few uncomfortable truths that Bengals fans have had to sit with for over a decade. Let's get into it. First, let's rewind, because you cannot understand how big this moment is for Amarius Mims without understanding just how cursed the Cincinnati Bengals offensive line has been. For years, and I mean years, Bengals fans have watched quarterback after quarterback get folded in half behind a line that ranged from mediocre to actively hazardous to Joe Burrow's health. We're talking about a fan base that has developed actual trauma responses to watching tape of their own offense. So when a former first-round pick starts flashing real, tangible, game tape visible development, that is not a small thing. That is an event. And according to people who track this stuff closely, Amarius Mims heading into year 3 might be the biggest offensive line development story in the entire league that nobody's talking about yet. Not enough people. Anyway, that's about to change. Let's get the backstory straight, because context matters here. Mims came out of the University of Georgia as one of the most physically gifted offensive tackle prospects in recent memory. We're talking nearly 6'8", a wingspan pushing 87 inches, over 340 pounds, and somehow still moving like a much smaller man. On paper, on measurables alone, evaluators were calling this a top 10 caliber talent. But here's where the story gets complicated, and where the doubts started creeping in. Mims didn't get a ton of game reps at Georgia. He dealt with some nagging injuries throughout his college career, nothing catastrophic, but enough that it limited his snap count and made it harder for teams to fully evaluate him in live action. And in this league, when you're dealing with a boom or bust developmental prospect, missing reps is a red flag that scares a lot of front offices off. So instead of hearing his name called in the top 10 like the tape and testing numbers suggested he deserved, Mims fell. He landed right in the middle of the first round, and the Bengals, who at that point had been searching under every couch cushion in Cincinnati for offensive line help, happily scooped him up. At the time, it felt like a swing for the fences, a high-risk, high-reward developmental project, the kind of pick that either turns into a decade-long building block or turns into a cautionary tale about athletic testing over production. Well, folks, 2 years later we might have our answer, and it is looking very, very good for Cincinnati. Now here's where I want to set the stage for what we're about to dig into, because this is important. Mims' rookie year was by most honest accounts serviceable, not flashy. Not the disaster some feared given the limited college reps, but not a takeover season either. He was still figuring things out, still adjusting to the speed of the professional game, still building the foundational technique that turns athletic freak into dominant offensive tackle. But then something happened in the second half of year 2. The tape started to change. And I don't mean subtly. I mean if you go back and watch Amarius Mims reps from the middle of last season through the end of it, you are watching a different player than the one who took the field as a rookie. And it's not just the eye test either, though the eye test alone is enough to get people excited. According to PFF's internal grading, which tracks essentially every single snap a player takes down to granular detail, Mims' numbers have been trending up. And trending up in a way that suggests this isn't a fluke. This is development. Real, sustained, snap-by-snap development. And when you combine that data with what your own eyes are telling you on tape, you start to understand why there's a growing chorus of draft analysts and offensive line evaluators quietly starting to whisper that if Amarius Mims takes even one more step forward in 2026, we could be talking about a top 10 offensive tackle in the entire NFL. Not top 10 Bengal. Not top 10 AFC North lineman. Top 10 in the whole league. Let that sink in for a second, because that is not a sentence Bengals fans have gotten to say about an offensive lineman in a very, very long time. So let's actually get into the tape, because I promised you receipts and I'm going to deliver. Let's start with pass protection, because this has always been the part of Mims's game that scouts love the most coming out of college, and it's the part of his game that's been the most consistently strong at the pro level. The first thing that jumps off the screen when you watch Mims in pass sets is his get-off, his first step off the snap. And I don't mean this in a small way. I mean this guy is routinely beating NFL edge rushers off the football before they've even fully processed that the ball has moved. Against Chop Robinson, one of the more explosive young pass rushers in this league, you can watch Mims get out of his stance almost before the ball has left the quarterback's hand. That kind of anticipation and first-step quickness is not something you can coach into a player who doesn't already have some natural feel for it. It's rare, and it's a foundation that makes everything else Mims does easier. Now, I do want to be fair here and give credit where it's due, because Bengals fans should know the coaching staff is scheming to help Mims out in some of these reps. The offense will frequently release a tight end or running back right off the hip of the tackle before a pass rush develops, and that forces the edge rusher to take a more inside angle rather than a clean, wide-open, outside path. That's a smart wrinkle, and it funnels rushers directly into what is Mims's biggest advantage: pure size and length. When Chop Robinson tries to rip through and yank Mims off balance, it just doesn't work, because Robinson is giving up a significant size disadvantage and Mims's frame simply absorbs it. Same story against Mike Green, another smaller, twitchy rusher who wants to win with quickness and hand usage rather than pure power. Green tries the two-hand chop move, tries to knock Mims's hands away to create an opening, and it just doesn't matter, because Mims has so much length and separation that he can control the rep from a distance most rushers simply can't operate inside of. Here's the blunt truth of it, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this. There are basically zero edge rushers in this league who are bigger than Amarius Mims, and there are basically zero who are as tall as he is. That means most of the time Mims isn't just playing a technique battle, he's playing a size and length battle that he wins before the ball is even snapped. But don't get it twisted, this isn't just a big guy standing there and mashing people. What separates Mims from some of the other massive tackles we've seen bust in this league, guys who had the size but couldn't move their feet, is that Mims can actually shift his weight and redirect. Watch him against Mike Green on a rep where Green tries a jab step to the inside, trying to bait Mims into overcommitting so he can loop back around the outside. A lot of heavier tackles get frozen or overcommit in that exact situation. Mims doesn't. His foot plants cleanly, he shifts his weight back to the outside, and suddenly Green has no path to the quarterback whatsoever. That combination of elite size with legitimate lateral agility is exactly why the ceiling here is so high. It's the rare package that made him a top 10 talent on paper in the first place, except now it's actually translating onto the field consistently instead of flashing occasionally. And here's where things get even more interesting, because I haven't even gotten to the signature matchup of this whole tape session yet. TJ Watt, a 10-year veteran, a future Hall of Famer, one of the most decorated pass rushers of this entire era. And when you put Amarius Mims across from TJ Watt, what you see is not a rookie or a second-year player getting overwhelmed by a legend. What you see is patience. Genuine, veteran-level patience. Mims doesn't panic and throw his hands early. He doesn't overextend trying to make a highlight reel block. He sits back, gets to his spot, stays calm, and lets Watt come to him. That is not normal for a player this early in his career. That's the kind of poise you usually only see from tackles who've been doing this for the better part of a decade. And it's a huge reason why a lot of people around the league are starting to buzz about Mims's ceiling. Now, was it a perfect performance against Watt? No, and I'm not going to pretend it was, because part of being honest with you all is showing you the good and the bad. There were reps where Watt got home with pressure, and at least one rep where the ball wasn't out on time and Watt cashed in with what would go down as a sack in the box score. On one particular rep, Mims's outside hand placement missed, Watt got the angle, and Joe Flacco took a shot that never should have happened. That's real, and that's part of the story too, because nobody's saying Mims is a finished product. He's not. He's a talented, rapidly ascending player who still has moments where the technique lapses, where the hand placement is a fraction of a second late, where a rep just gets lost entirely. But here's the difference between Mims and a lot of tackles who lose those reps. When Mims loses a rep, he rarely loses the entire battle. Watch him get beat on hand positioning against Watt on one particular stunt, get his outside arm controlled, seemingly caught in a bad spot, and then watch him recover, shift his weight, and wall Watt off from the quarterback anyway. That recovery ability, that second effort athleticism, is something a lot of bigger, heavier tackles across NFL history have never had. There's a long list of massive offensive tackles who simply could not recover once beaten, guys who once they lost their base or their positioning were done for the rep. Mims isn't in that category. He's shown, repeatedly, on tape, that he can lose a rep and still salvage the outcome through pure recovery athleticism. And that alone should terrify opposing pass rush coordinators heading into 2026. There's also a smaller detail buried in the tape that I think is honestly one of the most underrated indicators of where Mims is at developmentally: stunts and twists. If you followed offensive line play for any length of time, you know that picking up a stunt or a twist, where the defensive tackle and edge rusher essentially swap rush lanes to confuse the blocking scheme, is one of the hardest things to do consistently, especially for a young player. It requires processing speed, discipline to keep your hips square, and the ability to pass responsibilities off cleanly to a teammate mid-rep. And what we've seen from Mims, even working alongside a rookie guard learning the ropes right next to him, is quick, clean recognition of these stunts and twists. That's a mental processing element of the game, not just a physical one, and it suggests his growth isn't limited to the physical side of the ledger. His football IQ is catching up to his measurables, and that combination is exactly what turns a good player into an elite one. Let's talk about the hand battle for a second too, because if you're a true offensive line nerd like I am, this is where the tape gets genuinely fun to watch. There's a stretch of reps against Watt where the two of them are essentially locked in a wrist and grip battle, almost like two guys arm wrestling standing up, and what you notice is that Mims, because of his sheer hand size and grip strength, simply does not let go once he's got a hold. There's one particular sequence where Watt tries to bend the arc, tries to really turn the corner and get to the quarterback, and Mims stays attached to him the entire way, rides him down to the turf, and shuts the rep down completely. And look, I have to call out a moment on this tape that made me legitimately upset watching it live. Because there's a rep where Watt gets away with what should be an automatic penalty, hands directly to the face, and somehow it goes uncalled. Mims, to his credit, doesn't panic, keeps his hands locked in tight to his frame, and gives up basically nothing on the rep anyway, despite getting away with what should have been a flag. That's discipline. That's composure. That's exactly the kind of stuff that doesn't show up in a box score, but absolutely shows up when you're trying to project whether a young offensive tackle is truly ready to anchor a line for the next decade. Now let's pump the brakes for a second, because I promised you I wasn't going to sit here and pretend this is a flawless highlight reel, and it isn't. There's a rep later in that same game where Watt goes with an inside jab and a cross-chop combo, gets Mims to open up his hips the wrong direction, and works his way back to the inside for what should have been, and basically was, a lost rep in real time. Ball gets out just in time to avoid disaster, but that's a legitimate technique flaw that a savvy pass rusher exploited, and you can bet opposing coordinators around the league are going to study exactly how Watt got him to open up like that and try to replicate it. This is the part of the story where I have to be real with you. Mims is not there yet as a finished bulletproof pass protector. There are still reps, still specific counter moves, where the technique cracks just enough for an elite rusher to find daylight. But here's the thing that should give Bengals fans real hope. Almost every single flaw we're talking about here is a technique issue, not an athletic limitation or a physical ceiling issue. Technique can be coached. Technique improves with reps. And if the second half of last season is any indication of the trajectory this guy is on, there is real reason to believe those specific technical lapses get cleaned up as he logs more snaps against elite competition. There's one more pass pro rep I have to mention because it might honestly be the single most jaw-dropping moment on this entire tape. Grant Delpit, a safety, tries to blitz off the edge, and instead of trying to go around Mims, decides the smart play is to duck underneath him. I want you to sit with that decision for a second. A defensive back, listed at a fraction of Mims' size, decided the best path to the quarterback was underneath a nearly 6'8", 340-plus-pound offensive tackle. The result, unsurprisingly, is that Mims essentially just lifts him up like he weighs nothing and the rep is over before it starts. It's one of those plays that doesn't show up as a major statistical moment. But if you're evaluating raw physical dominance, it's about as clean an example as you're going to find on tape all year. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on pass protection, and rightfully so, because that's the part of Mims' game that scouts always believed in the most. But here's the part of the story that might actually be the more exciting development, at least according to people who watch this stuff closely, because it's the part of Mims' game that showed the most dramatic year-over-year growth, the run game. And I want to be completely honest with you all, because I was not initially sold on this. Watching Mims at Georgia, and even watching him early in his rookie season, there were moments where you'd watch the tape and think, where's the finishing power? Where's the nasty streak? He had all this size, all this length, all this athletic testing, and it didn't always translate into him actually imposing his will as a run blocker. That started to change as a rookie, and then last season, it fully opened up. The clearest example of this leap comes against the Steelers, where you can watch Mims not just engage T.J. Watt at the point of attack, but literally drive him 5, 6, 7 yards down the field on a single run play. That's not a stalemate block. That's not just holding your ground. That's a 340-pound man physically moving a future Hall of Fame pass rusher backward against his will, opening a running lane that Chase Brown turns into an explosive gain down the sideline. And here's the thing that I think gets lost when people just look at box score numbers for running backs. Those explosive runs don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because somebody up front created that lane. Chase Brown doesn't get to the races down that sideline if Mims doesn't manhandle Watt first. But it's not just the double-team power stuff, though there's plenty of that too. Like the rep against Mason Graham and the Browns' defensive front, where Mims helps displace a talented young defensive tackle before climbing to the second level entirely. It's the second-level blocks that really tell you something about a player's overall football intelligence and athleticism combined, because sealing off a linebacker in space is genuinely one of the hardest assignments for any offensive lineman, let alone one who's built like Mims. Doubling a defensive tackle to move him off the point of attack is one skill. Then disengaging from that double team, finding a linebacker who is actively trying to avoid you, and sealing him off cleanly enough to spring an explosive run. That's an entirely different, much harder skill. And Mims has shown, on multiple occasions now, that he can do both in the same play. There's even a rep in space where he ends up matched up with a linebacker in open space entirely. And rather than that being a mismatch in the linebacker's favor because of superior agility, Mims walls him off clean and lets his running back pick up extra yardage that a lot of tackles his size simply couldn't create. So let's zoom out for a second, because I want to put all of this in context for you. Because context is everything in this business. When you combine an elite pass pro get-off, legitimate lateral recovery athleticism, veteran-level patience against all-pro caliber pass rushers, quick and clean stunt recognition, and now, critically actual finishing power and second-level movement skills in the run game, you are looking at the checklist for a genuine top-tier NFL offensive tackle. This isn't projection anymore based purely on measurables the way it was coming out of Georgia. This is projection based on 2 years of accumulating, verifiable, on-field evidence that the traits are translating. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I've seen the comments, I've seen the message boards, I've seen the social media chatter. Some fans, understandably scarred by a decade of offensive line disappointment in Cincinnati, are going to say, Dre, calm down, we've heard this before, we've been burned before, don't get our hopes up. And look, that skepticism is earned. Bengals fans have every right to be cautious after years of watching promising linemen either get hurt, plateau, or simply never put it all together. But here's why I think this time is genuinely different, and it's not just vibes, it's not just hopium, it's that the data and the tape are agreeing with each other, when PIF's internal grading is trending sharply upward across a full season, and the tape independently shows you specific, repeatable technical improvements rep after rep after rep, that convergence is exactly what you want to see before you get excited about a breakout. It's not just one analyst's opinion. It's not just one flashy highlight. It's a sustained pattern across an entire year of football. Let's also talk about what this means for the Bengals as a franchise, because I don't think we can talk about Amarius Mims in a vacuum without talking about what a genuinely elite right tackle means for Joe Burrow and this entire offense. For years, the story of the Cincinnati Bengals has been insanely talented quarterback and skill position weapons, undermined by an offensive line that can't consistently protect him. We've watched Burrow take hits that made every fan in Cincinnati wince. We've watched promising seasons derailed by injuries that, fair or not, always get traced back to a shaky offensive front. If Mims takes that next step in 2026 that so many people are now starting to project, that fundamentally changes the equation for this entire offense. Suddenly, you're not asking, can our line hold up long enough for Burrow to work his magic? You're asking, how scary is this offense when Burrow has actual time in the pocket for a full 16-17 game season? That's not a small shift. That's potentially the difference between a good Bengals team and a genuinely scary, championship-caliber Bengals team. And look, I want to be clear about something because I don't want to oversell this to the point where it becomes irresponsible. Nobody, and I mean nobody, credible is saying Amarius Mims is already a finished, top 5, lock-it in all-pro tackle. That would be getting way ahead of the tape. What the tape shows, and what the data supports, is a player on a legitimate, sustained upward trajectory, with real, still existing flaws that need continued technical refinement, but with a physical and athletic ceiling that very few tackles in this entire league possess. The gap between good starting right tackle and top 10 right tackle in the NFL is often not about physical talent at all. It's about consistency. It's about eliminating the 1 or 2 lapses per game that elite rushers can still exploit. And if the second half of last season is any indication, that gap is closing fast. So here's where I land on all of this, and here's my genuine no-filter prediction heading into 2026. I think Amarius Mims is going to have a monster season. I think we are going to look back at this current stretch of tape, right now, in the middle of 2026, as the moment where the rest of the football world finally caught up to what Bengals fans and dedicated tape watchers already knew. I think there's a real legitimate path for Mims to finish this season as a top 10 offensive tackle in the entire NFL, and if he does that, I think we are going to be talking about him in Pro Bowl conversations sooner rather than later. Is that a guarantee? Of course not. Nothing in this league is guaranteed. Injuries happen, matchups vary week to week, and development is never perfectly linear. But based on everything we've broken down today, the trajectory, the tape, the data, the sheer rareness of his physical profile combined with the technical growth we're now seeing translate consistently, I would be shocked if Amarius Mims is not a significantly bigger name in the national football conversation by the time we get to the postseason this year. And that right there is why this story matters so much more than it might seem on the surface. This isn't just about one offensive lineman having a good stretch of tape. This is about a franchise that has been starving for stability and dominance up front for over a decade, potentially finding both in a player they took a calculated gamble on in the middle of the first round. This is about a quarterback who deserves every bit of protection he can get, finally getting a genuine building block on the right side of his line. And this is about a fan base that has earned the right to be a little bit excited even after everything they've been through. So here's the big takeaway, Cincinnati, and here's what I want you to walk away from this video remembering. Amarius Mims is not a hidden gem anymore. He is not a developmental project anymore. Based on the tape, based on the data, based on everything we just broke down together, he is on the verge of becoming one of the premier offensive tackles in the entire National Football League. And 2026 might be the year the rest of the country finally has to admit it. Keep watching, because if this trajectory holds, we are going to be talking about Amarius Mims a whole lot more before this season is over. If you enjoyed breaking this down with me, do me a favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Is Mims a top 10 tackle by the end of this season, or am I getting ahead of myself? I want to hear your take. And if you're not already subscribed to Dre Talk Sports, get on that right now, because we bring you no-filter basketball and football news, breaking stories, insider reports, and deep dive tape analysis like this all the time. Turn on those notifications too, so you never miss the next upload. I'll see you in the next one.